In the study of astronomical physics, the force of gravity is an invisible and immutable force that rules the movements of our heavenly bodies. Usually, this force keeps everything orderly in a symphonic dance of stable orbits and predictable movements. But every so often, the force of gravity can bring two bodies together in a cataclysmic explosion of rock and fire. I'd like to think that the subjects of our next documentary lived somewhere between those two scenarios, sometimes stably orbiting each other's massive talent, and other times smashing together and causing destruction and collateral damage all around them. But it was the gravity of their collective talent that kept them together, invariably, through multiple projects over many decades. Tonight, we're going to look at the brilliant and tumultuous career and the enduring friendship of bassist Jack Bruce and drummer Ginger Baker, next on If Guitars Could Speak. Hello friends, and welcome back to If Guitars Could Speak, the documentary series where we examine cool pieces of gear, interesting musicians, and amazing stories from classic rock history. Today we're going to look at the tumultuous relationship of two musicians that, despite their massive differences in oil and water mixture, just kept finding ways to stay together as the decades went by. Of course, I'm talking about Jack Bruce and Ginger Baker, most notably the rhythm section of Cream, along with Eric Clapton. But remember, if you like rock history stories like this, be sure to subscribe to the Guitar Historian channel and click the bell icon to get notified when we post new content. And make sure you hit that like button down below to let YouTube know that you think other classic rock fans would like to see content like this. Our story begins with a familiar name who is often described as the father of British blues, the man who launched 1,000 careers, Alexis Korner, who formed one of the earliest blues outfits in 1961 called Blues Incorporated. Korner's group would become known as a proving ground for some of the most gifted musicians in the UK, and many of them would go on to distinguished and successful careers of their own. In 1962, Korner established a regular Tuesday night rhythm and blues night at the Ealing Jazz Club in the west of London. This brought blues fans from around the British Isles to what was then the center of the British blues universe. Eric Clapton, Jimmy Page, Brian Jones, Rod Stewart, Mick Jagger and Keith Richards, and John Mayall are just a few of the names of musicians who would sit in on Tuesday nights along with the regular members of Korner's band. Among this revolving door of musicians was a drummer from Lewisham named Ginger Baker, who was already nearing his mid-20s and had already learned at the knee of one of England's most renowned jazz drummers of the post-war era, Phil Seaman. Baker already had chops by the time he joined up with Blues Incorporated, and his bandmates at the time would include organist Graham Bond, saxophonist Dick Hextall-Smith, and a young Scottish upright bass player named Jack Bruce, who would join in 1962. For his part, Bruce as well had already been around the block professionally, having trained as a classical cellist and later touring Italy with the Murray Campbell Big Band. Soon after, No Blues Incorporated would dissolve, and Bond, Baker, Bruce, and Hextall-Smith, along with guitarist John McLaughlin, who would later go on to form the Mahavishnu Orchestra, formed the Graham Bond Organization, which would go on to become a jazz-styled blues combo. It was in this band that the relationship between Jack Bruce and Ginger Baker would finally begin to take shape. Initially, the two musicians accepted each other's musical abilities and understood that they probably weren't going to find better players on their respective instruments anywhere, but it would soon become obvious that Baker and Bruce's personality were simply at cross purposes. Ginger would say of his time with Jack in the GBO, quote, "Jack's personality was Jekyll and Hyde. If you said the wrong thing, he would suddenly turn on you. One day during my drum solo, Jack began playing a bass thing with me. I was really getting off on it, phrasing with him on the bass drum. Suddenly he turned around and said, quote, 'You're playing too f***ing loud.' The result was that I nearly killed him. A bouncer had to pull me off. He was okay for a while, but then he'd yell again. Graham had tried to talk to him, and Jack just got pissed off. When he drove the band bus from Ipswich, he nearly killed us all. Of course, I was the heavy, so I had the job of doing it, but it was a band decision." Of course, Jack remembers it a slightly different way, saying, quote, "There had always been problems between Ginger and myself. We're kind of like brothers. When it's nice, it's great, but then sometimes it can really go wrong. He took it upon himself to fire me from Graham Bond, although he wasn't the band leader. He said I was playing too busy. I think I was just finding myself and a style very much influenced by James Jamerson. I was interested in trying to take the bass guitar out of the rhythm section. I was also influenced by jazz, Scott LaFaro, Charlie Mingus, so yeah, I was probably playing a lot of notes. He didn't quite agree with that. But it went far beyond professional or musical differences. The pair were known for knockdown, drag-out, bare-knuckle fisticuffs on stage. They would often sabotage each other's equipment, with Ginger cutting wires in Jack's bass amps and Bruce getting even by loosening Ginger's cymbals so that they fell crashing to the floor as soon as he'd used them. Eventually, Baker would keep trying to fire Bruce, but to no avail, as Jack would just keep showing up to the gigs. Graham Bond, the namesake of the group, was so lost in drug addiction himself, he simply did nothing to mediate or separate the two musicians. Finally, things got so tense that the legend goes that Baker pulled a knife on Bruce at an unknown gig, leading Jack to finally quit the Graham Bond organization in 1966. Although the group had minor commercial success, their distinctly jazzy feel would go on to inspire many musicians who would splinter off from the mainstream and go on to form their own jazz fusion and progressive rock outfits. You'd think that having a knife pulled on him would be the last time that Bruce would even want to be in the same room as Ginger Baker, but fate would have more in store for the pair. Like a periodical comet, Bruce would orbit a little further away for some years, but would always get pulled back in. Jack Bruce would quickly join John Mayall's Blues Breakers for a very short time, and although he didn't stay for more than a few weeks and didn't end up on any material at the time, it was obviously notable. It was the first time that Bruce would cross paths with guitarist Eric Clapton, who by then was already a legend in British blues circles. There are a few recorded live sets featuring Bruce on later Blues Breakers releases called Looking Back and Primal Solos. Bruce would then go on to join the seminal jazz rock group Manfred Mann, named after the band's keyboard player. Bruce would have his first taste of commercial success when Mann would have a #1 hit with Pretty Flamingo in May of 1966. Interestingly, it would be the first of only 2 #1 hits that Bruce was involved with, his second being a song called Lily the Pink by a comedy group called the Scaffolds, but unfortunately, Bruce would be uncredited on that recording. Laying future groundwork, Bruce would collaborate yet again with Eric Clapton for an Elektra Records release called What's Shakin' in June of 1966. We covered this a little bit in an old episode of If Guitars Could Speak that chronicled every single band EC was in between 1962 and 1970. If you've never seen it, it still remains one of my favorite pieces that I've done. Give it a watch after this one. But anyway, Clapton put together a one-time only supergroup, which included Bruce on bass along with his Manfred Mann bandmate, vocalist Paul Jones, Steve Winwood and Pete York from the Spencer Davis Group on keys and drums, and Ben Palmer, who went back to Clapton's Rooster days, also played some piano. The group only recorded 4 tracks, 3 of which ended up on the compilation, which would also feature tracks from the Lovin' Spoonful, the Paul Butterfield Blues Band, and Al Kooper and Tom Rush. This collaboration would eventually lead to a famous car ride after a Mayall gig. Ginger Baker had come to see the band, and specifically Eric, play in mid-1966 and offered to drive the guitarist home. But it would not be a free ride. Baker had plans to recruit whom he saw as the greatest six-stringer in England at the time, for a group that he envisioned as the best in the world. Eric knew Ginger had the chops, but eventually the conversation segued into who would round out the rhythm section on bass. Eric innocently suggested Jack Bruce, having just played with him in the Powerhouse and admiring his skills, feeling he was the best bass player that he'd played with. In the great documentary Beware of Mr. Baker, Ginger tells the story of nearly driving off the road when Clapton suggested Bruce, but Eric had no idea that their professional relationship had descended into such animosity. Ginger asked Eric, quote, "Now what did you have to go and mention him for?" At first Eric withdrew his nomination, but eventually came to think of Bruce as the best bass player in England, and so he issued the ultimatum that he would only be in the group if Jack was as well. Because Ginger was so desperate to start a group with Eric Clapton, he swallowed hard and agreed to the arrangement. Thus, the Mighty Cream was born, dubbed as such during an interview Clapton gave shortly after their union by referring to the musicians as the cream of the crop. But it wouldn't take long for Eric to witness the open wounds that his rhythm section still carried. Clapton would say, quote, "We had our first talk-through rehearsal at Ginger's house in Neasden, and those two had an argument right away. Jack had done an interview and let the cat out of the bag about the band. Ginger was upset about that, and it went along the lines of, "There you go again, you've done it again." I thought, wait, there's something going back here that I'm not aware of. Though "you've done it again" implied this was sort of a pattern that existed before I knew either of them. Despite the animosity, the trio knew that they had a chemistry that would sell records, and began to play the club circuit to great fanfare even before they'd had a large cache of songs to draw from. Finally, their debut album Fresh Cream was released in late 1966. Cream's success would truly take off in 1967 with their seminal release Disraeli Gears, which featured classic rock staples like White Room and Sunshine of Your Love. But despite the success, the volatile relationship between Baker and Bruce led to onstage shouting matches, more fisticuffs, and even a few temporary walk-offs by one band member or another. But when you saw Cream on one of their on nights, you were treated to a spectacle that not too many bands could touch at that time. It was three world-class musicians at the absolute height of their prowess, both technically and creatively. Eric Clapton would look back on the band with mixed emotions, later saying, quote, "It was very intense. It actually seems like we were together for 4 or 5 years, but in fact it was very short. My overall feeling about it now is that it was a glorious mistake. I had a completely different idea of what it would be before I started it, and it ended up being a wonderful thing, but nothing like it was meant to be. It was meant to be a blues trio. I just didn't have the assertiveness to take control. Jack and Ginger were the powerful, dominant personalities in the band. They sort of ran the show and I just played. In the end, I just went with the flow and I enjoyed it greatly, but it wasn't anything like I expected at all." Of Cream's bluesy side, Jack Bruce would later say in 1997, quote, "Because of the interaction between the three of us, our version of the blues just naturally took on a different structure. I'm So Glad," written by Skip James, was one of the first examples, and certainly Willie Dixon's Spoonful was something that we made our own. At that time, bands like John Mayall's Blues Breakers and Fleetwood Mac were trying to recreate the sounds of Chicago blues. Doing that was completely valid, but it was just something I didn't want to do. Those original blues records had been done so well, which meant you could only ever be second best. But if you treated those songs with a great deal of love and respect, you could remake them into your own. When we later got to meet people like Muddy Waters in Chicago, they were knocked out by our approach and how highly we regarded the music. It was clear that the three could put aside their personal and musical differences because they knew they were the best group of musicians in the world at the time. However, this arrangement would only last so long. One major factor that crept into Cream's demise, which seemed to come on as quickly as their formation, was Ginger Baker's long issues with heroin addiction. Of this, Jack would later say, quote, "Let's be honest about that. Ginger was a junkie. When I first met him, he was a registered heroin addict. That was the situation in this country in 63, 64, very healthy and civilized because there was no black market for drugs. But Ginger did fall off the wagon when we had early success doing Top of the Pops. He had this thing some people have. He was scared of success. He would do something just at the wrong moment, like OD in the dressing room. Oops, oh well. But we had a rule in the early days of the band that Ginger wouldn't do hard drugs, and he mostly stuck to it. By late 1968, Cream would officially disband, after only about 30 months of activity. Obviously, they became legends in that time, but the odyssey of Ginger and Jack's constant fighting and tension had led their guitarist nearly to the point of nervous breakdown. Clapton would say later, quote, "The workload was pretty severe. We were playing 6 nights a week, and I lost weight until I was about 9 stone and I looked like death. I was in bad shape. It wasn't so much self-abuse as self-neglect. I think that all added to the psychology of the situation, which was pretty tricky at the best of times. Ginger and Jack were pretty dynamic characters and pretty overwhelming. It felt like I was in a confrontational situation 24 hours a day. Half my time was spent trying to keep the peace, and on top of that, you're trying to be creative and make music. I was calling home to Robert Stigwood, our manager, and saying, 'Get me out of here. These guys are crazy. I don't know what's going on, and I've had enough.' He'd always say, 'Just give it one more week.' That was bearable as long as there was no visible alternative, but when something came along that showed another way, that was it for me." And so Ginger Baker and Jack Bruce would go their separate ways. Jack would release many solo albums over the years alongside his friend and lyricist Pete Brown, who had been heavily involved in Cream's songwriting, like 1969's Songs for Taylor, 1971's Harmony Row. Bruce would also become well known for many successful collaborations over the years, but this isn't the video to go into all of them. But my favorite collab that I will mention, however, is his hookup with our second forgotten fretmaster, Robin Trower, on the great 1981 album BLT that was recorded with Bill Orton on drums. The pair would go on to record several more albums over the years. Ginger's post-Cream career would see the drummer in the spotlight many times, including his next project, the short-lived supergroup Blind Faith with Eric Clapton, Steve Winwood, and Rick Retch. Eric was not exactly pleased when he saw his former bandmates show up to the rehearsals, starting the process on the wrong foot and leading to the group only recording one album and basically falling apart on the US tour later the next year. Ginger would also go on to form jazz rock group he called Ginger Baker's Air Force, which featured Ginger's old bandleader Graham Bond. Later, Ginger would trek through Nigeria in his Land Rover as he traveled to Lagos to open his recording studio, Batakota Studios. This studio would become best known for housing Paul McCartney and Wings for the recording of Band on the Run. Later, Ginger would recede from public life for several years, buying an olive farm in Tuscany. He would dabble unsuccessfully in acting later in the 80s. But Baker's and Bruce's paths would cross after 15 years in 1993 when Jack Bruce started a friendly relationship with Northern Irish axeman Gary Moore. The pair decided to record some tracks together, and shockingly, when the discussion led to who would play drums, Jack suggested that they call Ginger. Once again, the titanic pull of gravity brought Baker into Jack's mind. Moore was a little hesitant, though, even asking Jack if he was really sure that he wanted to work with Ginger again, but Bruce simply replied, quote, "It'll be great. Don't worry." This collaboration led to the album Around the Next Dream in May of 1994. Gary remembered a story from the recording saying, quote, "One day I said to Jack, can you ask Ginger to play the hi-hat pattern like he did on Born Under a Bad Sign?" Jack said, "No way, I'm not f***ing asking him. You ask him." So I pressed the button in the control room and asked him to play that pattern, and he said, "Yeah, sure, man, no problem." And Jack looked at me speechless. They were just like an old married couple. It's just the way they were. The breathlessly short-lived power trio produced some really kick-ass music, though, and Moore's incendiary, shocking playing is on full display. If you're looking for a classic rock album with a more modern sound, check out BBM's only release. But the old ghost would start to creep in to the Baker-Bruce relationship once again, and the trio would fold before it came to blows, at least this time. In 2003, Jack nearly died when years of drug and alcohol abuse finally caught up to him and he received a liver transplant. However, his body initially rejected the new organ, which led to a close call, but after this, Bruce would enjoy many years of relatively good health. This would lead to a reunion of Cream in 2005, which certainly raised more than a few eyebrows in rock circles. And this would culminate in an amazing run of shows at London's Royal Albert Hall and New York's Madison Square Garden. The power trio was definitely older and definitely different, but they were no less the giants that Carlos Santana had called them in the late 60s when he saw them in their heyday. Even though the pair of grizzled old rockers put aside their differences for the reunion, they just couldn't help get their jibes into each other. Much of the animosity stemmed from arguments surrounding the volume of Jack Bruce's bass amp, with Baker claiming that it actually damaged his hearing back on Cream's Goodbye tour in 1968. This argument would come up again and again, with Baker telling Bruce at one of the reunion gigs in 2005, "You're too f***ing loud." Whisperings began to surround Cream in the early 2010s when there were rumors that the trio would reunite once again for a series of shows, but as usual, Bruce and Baker found ways to blame each other for the gigs falling through. Jack said, quote, "Everybody had agreed about doing it, but then I think Ginger upset Eric. He said something or did something, so it's not happening. Ginger, from what I've heard, is a bitter old man, and I'm quite a cheerful old chap. I quite like to just enjoy my life." And then Ginger would of course say, quote, "I'd refuse to do it. First of all, it was Eric who phoned me up and convinced me. The reason I didn't want to do it was because of what happened in New York in 1968 when the Magic was destroyed. The reason why we broke up in the first place re-emerged on stage at Madison Square. You'll notice I'm talking about Eric in a nice way, but there was another person in the group. It wasn't just a problem with the volume of the bass guitar, it was the problem of being humiliated in front of 20,000 people. Jack Bruce has apologized many times since, but he's been doing that to me ever since I first played with him. He gets tearful and says, 'I love you, man,' but the volume thing has damaged my hearing to this day. I just cannot play with other people playing too loud on stage. It's too painful." Of course, all talk of a reunion would end on 25 October 2014 when Jack Bruce would finally succumb to liver disease, passing away at the age of 71. There is a story that in the final hours of his life, Bruce began to phone friends to have one last chat with them. But when he called Ginger, the conversation was hysterically brief. After Ginger said hello, Jack simply said, "I'm dying, Ginger, f*** you," and hung up the phone. That was going to be the one time that Jack Bruce got the last word. Both Eric Clapton and Ginger Baker would attend Jack's funeral, and Ginger Baker would hang on all the way to 5 October 2019 when he would pass away at the age of 80. Despite everything these men battled, their own addiction demons and multiple health problems, they both lived to a ripe old age and continued making music right up until the end. Gary Moore called the pair like a married couple. Eric Clapton called them pretty overwhelming. But the reality of the situation was that when Jack Bruce and Ginger Baker got together, great, timeless music happened. They were brothers in arms, and sometimes at arms, but unlike most rock feuds, which usually end up as juvenile musicians throwing passive-aggressive barbs at each other in the press, these two men not only knew how the other felt about him, but they continuously sought each other out again and again because they knew that they were the best on their respective instruments. In the end, Ginger would call Jack, quote, "a fine man" after his passing. Now, music history will lock these two massive musical talents into orbit together forever. When you talk about one, it will be hard not to talk about the other, and I'm sure somewhere Jack Bruce is laughing at that statement, and Ginger Baker is probably calling me a fucking idiot. But that's another episode of If Guitars Could Speak. Thanks for joining us yet again as we broke down the relationship of these two classic rock juggernauts. Remember to subscribe to the Guitar Historian channel for more content like this, and make sure you hit the bell icon next to it to make sure you don't miss a thing when we post new content. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time.